Sorry. Sorry, Bob. I mean, Jack. How long have I been calling you Bob? To me, you were such a Bob, but it's a Jack. I was wondering how you came from John to Bob. Because I see your name in the list here. Sorry.
It's okay. I've been called worse, trust me.
I called you Bob from the first day onwards. I said to someone, Bob is here. And they're, oh, okay.
And it was funny when you said, oh, yesterday I think, John, there is no John here, right? John
there is, of course. Oh my God.
I wasn't going to claim John.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, yesterday. I hadn't looked really on the list yesterday. Now I realize good one, that one as well. Okay. Anyway, let's take a moment. I just read this. Is this a question? Or I'm merely labeled Jack, not Bob. And then I got it. Okay, anyway. Let's take a moment. Let's take a moment to refresh our motivation. So to think that we're here not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. So may this study, reflection and meditation on the Heart Sutra become a cause for us to attain the enlightened state of a Buddha. To be able to lead all of the sentient beings to the same state. Okay. All right. Okay, so yesterday Kate said something, and then Mike said something after class, and it made me think. They both made a really good point. I mean, what we're studying here, of course, is a very advanced topic. It's emptiness, but it's difficult to make it relevant in our daily life, especially in the beginning. You were saying it feels like a brain teaser, rather than a means right now that helps me to deal with my day-to-day problems, right? Something like to that. I mean, something to that effect. I mean, that dependent arising seems much more relevant, seems much more effective when we meditate, when we, reflect on the Dharma, in particular in this case on dependent arising, seems more relevant or more effective than emptiness. Yes, Kate?
I guess the question was, is emptiness necessary? I felt like I was able to get to a lot of the non-I stuff just through dependent arising.
Just through dependent arising. Is emptiness necessary? If you were to get to the non-I, you would take emptiness as your object naturally, right? And so the question wouldn't arise. And also Mike said, well, what else can we meditate on that affects us in our daily life, right? And a very good point. I mean, I'm glad the interest is there to take something with you that you can use in your daily life. Of course, some of you, if you've studied this for some time, maybe for a few years, it's easier to take a very difficult, a very profound topic such as emptiness and bring it into your life. but it's still difficult. And I agree with Kate when she says it seems like dependent arising helps much more in terms of self-centeredness, for instance, right? Which is really the main trouble in the sense, well, of course, self-grasping or the misperception, the root misperception of reality is the main cause. However, that it's not exactly the troublemaker. I mean, if we only had that and we didn't have self-centeredness, we'd be pretty much okay. It was just a wrong view that doesn't emotionally affect us. So the thing with our mind, there's something interesting about the working of our mind. It's got two aspects. It's got a more rational aspect and it's got an emotional aspect. A rational and an emotional, right? So the emotional includes both beneficial as well as harmful emotions. Love, compassion, and so forth on one hand as beneficial emotions, but then also anger, aversion, attachment, and so forth as harmful emotions. And then you have the rational side of the mind. So actually, before we get angry, we usually use the rational part of the mind, but it's not always correct. I mean, rational in the sense, oh, they just said that to me. Why would they say that to me? I really helped them the other day. And I was always a good person. How dare they? So there's this rational kind of like this thought process, which then leads to a feeling of discomfort. I mean, if someone says something to you, the first moment there's a neutral feeling, right? Just right after you heard it. And then you start thinking, oh, what did they just say? They said that to me in front of everyone, right? I mean, it's just this process that takes place. And then within a short time, then the exaggeration sets in. They said that to me. That is so terrible. If they had said it to someone else, we probably wouldn't give it much thought. Oh, they just said jerk. Okay. And that's it. But in our case, we make a whole story from it. It becomes bigger, and anger arises, right? So it's the rational that we use, the reflection. I call it rational, but this thought process of they have said this, so therefore, and so forth. It's some kind of analysis. It's not always correct, but it's still this rational aspect of our mind. And those two work together. The rational aspect is then used to generate anger in this case, or attachment. This person is really good for me. Oh, it's wonderful to be around them. If I could always be around them, I'd be so much happier. You know, this kind of analysis until I come to the conclusion, yeah, I want to be with this person, as an example. Okay? So those work together. But what makes us act is not the rational. The rational leads to an emotional response, and the emotional mind then acts, right? It's the emotions, it's on the emotional level that we act. If there was no attachment and no anger after this analysis, we wouldn't act accordingly. So it's always that emotional level that is important. For instance, on a rational level, we all know we're going to die. We could die tomorrow. But on an emotional level, it feels like, nah, I'm too busy. I've got no time to die tomorrow. I've got, a lot left to do. It kind of feels that way. It doesn't make sense. So on the rational level, if I ask you, do you think it's possible you could die tomorrow? Sure, I could die in the next hour. It's not impossible. But emotionally, it feels very different. And it's the emotional that governs our actions. So we're not preparing for death. We may have a huge mess in our home, financially and everything else. And if we were to die now, it'd be a disaster for those left behind, right? I mean, just an example. I'm not saying that's the case in your case, but just saying we're not emotionally prepared for the fact, or not prepared for our possibly imminent death. Therefore, these two aspects, I think they're important to understand. And we utilize them when we meditate as well. We utilize the analytical to then come to the conclusion love and compassion make sense, and hopefully act out of love and compassion. Does that make sense? And we also this is also reflected in our meditation when I ask you to analyze and see whether there's a feeling arises. I keep saying, is there a feeling, right? Something like, oh yeah. And that emotional response, you focus on it to allow for it to grow stronger. And then hopefully it changes your actions. Am I making sense? This rational versus the emotional. So our life is very much controlled by that rational and the emotional, except our rational approach is influenced by our misperception. And it colors all our rationalizing, our analysis, and therefore it gives rise to anger and other afflictions. So these afflictions, which are called afflictive emotions sometimes, they don't arise, you don't have anger just suddenly. You don't suddenly, like without someone saying something, I mean, you may be grumpy or something, but usually there's something. There's something, a sound that bothers you or whatever. And it goes very quick from being peaceful until you get angry. So, therefore, that being the case, now we're trying to replace that irrational, really irrational. I mean, it's the rational aspect of our mind, but it acts often irrationally. We try to replace it with a better understanding of reality. And hopefully are able to bring this in our daily thought processes. So to such a degree that, for instance, someone says something and right away I get angry. Let's take the word selfish. Okay? We talked about words this morning. I also spoke about selfish before. So to make this practical, I mean, we feel insulted a lot, I guess, right? I mean, those are some of the reasons we get upset. It's not like we get beaten up that often. We're past that time. We're no longer little. So therefore, it's more like verbal insults are more of an issue. It's not physical insults. So therefore, to reflect this word that they just used, does it exist in and of itself as something negative? Right? I mean, there's a sense that horrible word, but it doesn't exist in and of itself. To give it a moment, and we may not be able to do it right then and there, but that's why you take it with you to the medication cushion in the evening, and you go, what was the hardest to deal with today? What was it today? Oh, this person's saying such and such. Well, let me analyze it. Let me look at it. Let me see the whole picture. It's a lot about seeing the whole picture and not just focusing in on that word and me and my importance or whatever. I mean, I'm exaggerating here, but oftentimes we don't see the whole situation and see how bad was it that they called me selfish. Am I still selfish? Yeah. Actually, yes. And I may have done something that was selfish and I wasn't aware of it. So that could actually lead to a sense of gratitude. Oh, I'm glad they pointed it out. They give me the opportunity to improve myself, to be more self-reflective in a situation such as the one that occurred today, whenever that incident took place. So that's one thing. And then also, well, why would they have said, like maybe they were really upset. What about their situation? Maybe they were unhappy. Maybe something went wrong. And use it to generate compassion, for instance. But also understand what are the causes and conditions that give rise to something like that. My own behavior, the other person, and so forth, their bad day, whatever. So kind of get a sense, and we don't necessarily need to get it right, but it makes sense that they were not peaceful and happy and so forth when they said that. And they probably regret by now what they've said. And even if they don't, that's even worse, because they're just strengthening this habit. So in that way, to just give it some thought, and we can let it go. We can let go of this sense of resentment and so forth. It just, put it into perspective. And the person definitely has some good qualities. So right now, I didn't see the good qualities, but let's not forget the good qualities. Let's think about them. So, and when I say the whole picture, that is so important. That is so important. I also spoke about criticism earlier on, right? I addressed receiving criticism, but I haven't spoken about criticizing another person yet, well, we may even share this with another person, that we were insulted by that person. But the problem oftentimes is when we just tell that side, the person comes across as really negative, and other people get the impression they're just an abusive person. So it's always good to also add the positive, to say, oh, I may have done something today, so they kind of said I was such and such, but I also know they're a good person. I know they're actually, and we can always think of a positive quality. Of course, if we don't know them at all, it's different. But then we're usually not that upset anyway if they call us a jerk, right? Who cares? Some, I don't know, banana salesperson who we don't know, we don't really care about it. I mean, it's definitely not something personal, they don't know me. So to then also make sure that in the other person's mind, this kind of one-sidedness doesn't arise. To always, when you talk about someone, even if you point out their negativities, which sometimes can be, of course, helpful in certain circumstances so they know, but then always point out something positive. And if you want to criticize them, to make sure that they know they're not misunderstood. To also say to them what you appreciate about them. And then maybe, if it seems right, to say, well, there's just been one situation I may have misunderstood, but you know, when you said such and such, it was kind of hurtful, and I wanted to find out what had happened, or something to that degree, right? So it's all about seeing it from different angles, not just from my perspective. Put myself into the other person's shoes, for instance. And if I don't exist inherently, I can do that. I couldn't do it if I existed inherently, but my mind is just focused on me and my issues. But that's just because I've got that self-centeredness that comes from my misperception. But since that's just mind-made, well, what about the other person? I mean, mothers can do it. They can be very concerned about their children and just think of their well-being all the time. They can do it. We can do it. So you see, even if you don't find emptiness directly that helpful, of course not, it's difficult, we're not used to it. But don't completely do away with it. Allow this to come into your reflection. So to go back to Mike's point, something that is practical. What I think, I mean, we can only work with our day-to-day experiences on a daily basis. We take those and we make them part of our meditation. We look at them. We apply the Dharma. That's taking refuge in the Dharma. Taking the mirror of the Dharma and using that, or the looking glass of the mirror of the Dharma, and let's look through this looking glass at the situation and see whether we can interpret it that way. Okay. So the way I just gave you this example, so everything you've learned, so they've said this to me, but it's impermanence. They've said it this morning, it's gone. The words are spoken, they're gone. Holding on to them is me holding on to permanence. Holding on to my grudge, holding on to my resentment towards that person is a sign of me seeing that person now as the same person who insulted me, right? So those are all thought processes. Everything you learn, you can bring into that reflection. Okay? How about I put myself into their shoes and think, I am you, and this other person is I, right? Because it's just a matter of familiarity. I. But how about you just think, the others are I, and this is you, right? And since I'm so used to that I is so important, suddenly I think, oh, I, this is there, this is I over there. That's most important. And it's funny how your mind can actually change. You do it once, you do it twice, you get used to it. That's the one thing about our mind. There's nothing, as Shantideva says, that doesn't become easier through familiarity. Yeah? And if it makes sense, if it's merely labeled, I is merely labeled, and you is merely labeled, I can switch it around. I exchange myself for others in that sense, right? And if you want to get a general sense of the kindness of others, just to have more love and more care in general, not for a specific person, look around everything we enjoy. The food we enjoy, the room we enjoy, the roads we use, the cars we use. If it wasn't for others, so precious. Our laptop doesn't have the intention to be of service to us, and still we keep it very precious because it gives us a great service. So others may not have the intention to benefit us, but they still make all this available. So one of my teachers actually did this meditation, kind of told us to think of every road you've just traveled and think of how many people worked on that road, how much sweat and hardship people underwent, or how much sweat was produced just through kind of building that road, right? How much they sweated and how hard they worked and how much exhaustion went into that road that I can now use and don't have to take, I don't know, some detour, right? So those are all thought processes. Usually we're so busy with what's good for me, what's good for I, da, 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 da. So to make that space and to think the kindness of others, if it wasn't for others, right? And it all makes sense because just being obsessed with me, I know at least I have some belief possibly after learning about the Heart Sutra that this is not based on reality. And that encourages me more to do this. So there's a lot to do. There's so much we can do. Deal with our afflictions. That's Dharma practice is all about reducing and eventually overcoming our afflictions. Self-centeredness being the most serious to a certain degree, but also the other ones. Of course, anger having arisen from self-centeredness, and that way self-centeredness being serious, but anger being even more destructive. Okay, so I hope that helps a little bit. Just use your incredible intelligence that everyone has. That's what I said in the beginning. Try to use everything that you hear as a personal instruction and see what is it you can do with this, right? Use your own intelligence. Play with it, because only you know your life. Only you know what is going on, what are your challenges, what are your weaknesses, and so forth. So here are the different methods. Pick and choose the methods that work best for you, right? But do it. If you want to feel better and more peaceful and have less worries, etc. If you like to continue worrying, etc. Okay, go on like that, but maybe try it out, right? And I'm sure you've done that already to a certain degree. But don't let emptiness go. I know exactly how you feel, Kate, of course. I feel the same way, right? Emptiness doesn't hit me in the same way as, the story about the serial killer with dependent arising. That really hit me. Yeah, much more so. Okay. Anyway, I was glad that both of you brought it up. It was kind of related. And let's just finish dependent arising, and then we can go back to the sutra. So we've been going through this example, the snake versus the rope, which is such a good example for two reasons. Being merely labeled, not finding the snakeness, but also lacking inherent existence, therefore. Because it is merely labeled and the snakeness cannot be found, therefore it's not inherently a snake. Okay. In the first case, the coiled speckled rope is not the basis of designation of the snake because it does not perform the function of a snake. Whereas in the second case, the snake aggregates, the snake mind and body perform the function of a snake and thus are a suitable basis of designation. That's the difference between them. Of course, there's a difference. You need a suitable basis of designation. Without that, labeling is not proper labeling, or a type of labeling that is sufficient to be able to call something conventionally this, that, and the other, to say it exists. Hence, even though anything that exists is merely designated, whatever is merely designated does not necessarily exist. See that It goes both ways. I mean, it goes one way but not the other. So what exists must be merely designated, but just because it's merely designated, it doesn't have to be existent, because I can designate snake onto a rope, and that doesn't make that a snake. Or I can designate, and we do it with our anger, for instance. Total jerk, 90% jerk. That's not true. 90%, like as Aaron Beck would say, as Aaron Beck used to say, 90% of what we perceive, or the negativity in the person we're angry with, is a projection, is a wrong labeling, to put it into Buddhist terms. However, both the snake designated on the basis of the rope and the snake designated on the basis of the snake aggregates are similar in that they cannot be found as existing independently of designation and inherent in the rope or the aggregates. So they cannot exist as independently of designation and inherent in the rope or the aggregates. In that way, they are the same. Neither neither the snake on the basis of the actual snake body exists independently and without designation, just as the rope doesn't exist in that way either. That is why past masters gave the example of labeling a snake on the basis of a coiled speckled rope in order to illustrate the third level of dependent arising. Furthermore, conceptual consciousness not only labels things in dependence on their basis of designation, it also designates them in relation to and in dependence on other phenomena. For instance, a man is labeled son in dependence on his parents, grandson in dependence on his grandparents, brother in dependence on his sibling, father in dependence on his child, and so forth. Right? This goes into, that reflects also what is in that, in that, this handout on the sense of identity. Apart from being labeled a son, grandson, brother, and father in relation to his parents, grandparents, sister, and daughter, respectively, the man is not inherently a son, etc. And no sonness, grandsonness, and so forth can be found among his mind or body. Okay, so let's leave this for now. There's just a little bit more in terms of the mutual dependence, but I want to address James' question about, you are James, right? James' question about the tableness and so forth. And collective karma is another one. Collective karma, tableness. Okay. You see, there's a sense there must be something in there to make it a table. But really all there is that there are certain defining characteristics that this table possesses and that table possesses and other tables possess, based on which we would call it a table. But that can also lead to disagreement, because of what I believe a table to be may not be in accordance with what other people believe a table to be. So if I believe a table has to have 4 legs and you think it has 3, we disagree on what we call a table or not, right? So you would think a 3-legged table is a table. You would call it that, and I would call it something else. So in that case, you would say this is a table and the 3-legged table. But I would say, oh, this is a table, but the other one, the 3-legged one, isn't. Right? So that shows it's totally a convention. It's individually, subjectively, on a certain level, individually quite different, actually. I mean, tables and chairs, we all agree pretty much. But who knows, in our culture, if you go to other cultures who've never seen a chair and a table, they would find it really differently. I mean, quite differently. And also, in terms of other things, beauty and, I don't know, attractiveness, there is pretty obvious what we label beautiful. I mean, even within the same cultural group, a haircut, right? I don't know, a mullet or something.
I think I see some dogs with shoes walking.
Oh, could you check which shoes they just took off with? That's a good idea before they're all gone. Oh no.
What color?
yeah, we could just maybe put them like this, then there's more space, and we put them on the upper. Maybe they figured out how to grab them from... Oh no. Because also, oh, because they're on the floor, yeah. But whoever's it is, let's get the shoes back. Did they get them back, do you think? Yeah, oh good. Okay. Oh. Okay, so even within the same group, right? Some like a mullet. A mullet is like, when your hair have shorter here and then longer there, right? That was like the 80s, isn't it? What is it? Sideburns. Right? Some people think they're pretty. Or, I don't know, what would you call that?
Mohawk.
Mohawk, that's right, a mohawk. So it's like, for some people that's really pretty, and for others not. So again, labeling it as beautiful or not, here in this case, the huge differences, the defining characteristics of beauty are very different for different individuals. So in that case, we have a better sense maybe that phenomena are merely labeled in terms of beauty and ugliness and so forth. But when it comes to water and fire, we have a sense, oh, for everyone that's the same. But of course, fire, like I talked about, the heat of fire, you need to have a certain body, say the human body, for instance, that considers that to be hot. But you could have a different body, like different, oh yeah, there he is. Oh, he's been really successful. 2 more shoes. Oh, they were ours. Oh, were they? Anyway, so therefore, in that sense, where's he gone to? Went that way.
Oh no.
Hello.
Actually, really nice of him.
Yes, very nice. That's why I feel hesitant to continue talking, and he misses stuff. So, in that sense, when we say tableness, do we really need tableness? Or is it not certain defining characteristics that some objects share? Or in the case of collective karma, there are certain experiences that are similar. And based on that, we say we have a collective karma. For instance, we have the collective karma to be here together in this room. I'm saying similar because not all our experiences are the same. Right? Some are bored, some are not, some are neutral, whatever, right? Everyone's got a different experience. But just from the... Oh, thank you for taking care of that. How many did you get?
Just 1 pair.
Oh, 1 pair, okay.
They're broken. Impermanent.
Oh, impermanence, oh gosh. Yeah.
Maybe really take your slippers, your cheapest shoes you have when you come here.
Yeah, better to put on the cheapest.
So bring your good trekking shoes.
Yeah. But anyway, so we were just saying, just to repeat it again, so just to take like certain like haircuts, for instance, for some person it's beautiful, for another person it's ugly. So again, the defining characteristics for beauty and ugliness are individually different. But of course there's a difference between that and fire, water and so forth, where we all agree basically, at least as humans, we have a similar experience when it comes to the defining characteristics of water and so forth. So the basis of designation is perceived in a similar way. And I was just talking about collective karma as well. So collective karma means that is labeled, that term is given to situations that are similar. So we have the collective karma to be in this room right now. We don't have the collective karma to all sit on this seat. Only you have the karma to sit on this seat. Right? Or we have all women in this room have the collective karma to be female. All humans in this world have the collective karma to be human. So we all share some collective karma. It's oftentimes used for an experience such as, let's say, we're all in the same train and there's a train accident. Or we all played the lottery and of millions of people, we're the 100 people or we're the 30 people who won the lottery. Like the positive scenario versus a negative one. So in the case of all of us experiencing a train wreck, for instance, individually, of course, we have different experiences. Some are not hurt, some are just traumatized, others are hurt, someone else gets killed, etc. Everyone's experience, of course, is individually different. But just the fact that we were all in that train, we've accumulated a karma that has some similarity and that ripens at a similar time. But as I said, you can apply this to anything, that we're female or male at the same time in a certain world. We share that collective karma. There we have an interest in Buddhism. We share that. Okay. So that's what collective karma. So again, the basis is some similarity. Now, going back to the point of the table, because we don't realize that, it gives rise to racism. As an example, right? Because we perceive a person and we label a certain ethnicity. Let's say all those with red cheeks, like myself, right? Not that obvious right now, but if I use the right soap and I scrub for half an hour, you'll see. So, all those with red cheeks. So you meet this person with red cheeks, and she's really obnoxious. Okay? So in your mind, red cheek, obnoxious. Red cheek. So there's some red cheekness, and you associate it with obnoxiousness. The next person you see with reddish cheeks, oh, obnoxious. It's called generalization. But what it is also is a sense there's something inherent in that person. That it's inherent in me, and if you associate it with something negative, I mean, oftentimes we associate certain characteristics with an ethnicity, whether that accords with reality or not, but we do oftentimes. So I took the example of reddish cheeks, and then this reaction, or this sense of some negative quality, yeah, or being German, so all Germans are stiff. A lot of Germans are stiff, right? But we can't generalize. Yeah, can't generalize. So, therefore, that leads to generalization. That leads to also racism if it's dependent on the ethnicity of the person. Okay, skin color, I don't know, maybe even cultural background and so forth. Okay, and we need to understand that each and every individual person is different, and that we may red-facedness, we may label it on the person because there are certain defining characteristics, but there are also many other defining characteristics, and it's merely labeled, it's not intrinsic in them. And just because one person has a certain, I don't know, quality that I consider to be negative, maybe another person finds it incredibly attractive, right? Only because of that, I cannot draw the connection and believe that this is true for all the other people who have similar, I don't know, similar look, a similar ethnicity. So I think that's an important part. We need to check our own mind. We need to check our own mind. In the US, for instance, I hear, and this is not just in the US, in Germany it happens as well, but because there's a greater rate of crime in a certain group, population group, therefore people have more of a tendency to believe if a person of a certain ethnicity, they must engage in more crimes, and there's more fear. And sometimes people get killed because of their skin color, because people assume that That's racism. That's the problem. We can never, you can never assume just because they come from this country and so forth, or just because they have a certain appearance, etc. Yeah? Because there's nothing intrinsic in them. They're similar features, and we could all disagree. We could still disagree. It's not cut in stone. So whether it's a table or not. If the defining characteristic of a table for you means 4 legs, then it's okay for you. For me, it may mean something different, or vice versa. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you don't need a tableness. You just need a certain basis of imputation, and then you may label it this, that, and the other. But good examples of how it's not clear-cut and it's not inherent in the object is a politician's actions, whether they're good or not. Right? Think of a politician. There's so many different politicians, especially in a democracy. You have different political parties that are represented by, certain people. And those representatives, if they pay a lot of attention to the education of children, then those who have children will say, oh, that's a good candidate, that's a good candidate. Those who don't have children, they don't care. For them, it's not necessarily a good candidate. For them, maybe other issues are important. The fact that this other candidate wants to build more roads, and you live somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and there's no road, so you're interested, of course, in the candidate. So, is it a good candidate or not? To me, it seems that he's inherently good because he's taking care of the education of children. No, he's inherently good because he's building roads. But it just depends on what we need, on what we want. In the relation to that, I would say this is good and this is not good. Right? And of course, you have these cultural differences. Oh, this is so funny in Tibetan society when East meets West, as in like Tibetans meeting Westerners. Because many times, this is years ago when my teacher, Kitty Senju Rinpoche, was still alive, I would translate for him. And there were sometimes, I remember this girl, she was from, I don't know what country she was from a Western country, and she had a Tibetan boyfriend. And she wanted to talk to Rinpoche about the trouble she had with her boyfriend. So Rinpoche didn't immediately have time, so we were waiting outside, and I said, so tell me the story, what does he do? And she's like, I gave him a present the other day, and instead of opening it, he just put it to the side. And later on, when I wasn't there, he opened it. He's so rude. And I was like, no, that was very polite. It would have been very rude for a Tibetan to open it, would have considered to be greedy, to open it up and say, whoa, implying you want more. Right? Okay? So, therefore, it's like, okay, I appreciate it, but I leave it for now. It's not like I need more of that. Okay, so you don't make a big deal out of it. Okay, you put it to the side. But of course, if you're excited, you can't wait. You wait until the person is gone and then you open it. So she saw that as some kind of insult. And there were 2 or 3 other things that were so different. And in the end, she was like, I don't need to see Rinpoche. Because she understood it wasn't, and the thing is also, Tibetans are not used to discussing things and talking about them in the same way we do. For them, sometimes it becomes a big deal, and you're making an elephant out of a mosquito, out of an ant. You make a big thing out of it, and that's not encouraged. So, also, you don't necessarily apologize when you make a mistake. You step on someone's foot, you say sorry, yes. But if you make a mistake, you show it in other ways. Because just saying so, that's just words. You prove you're not going to do it again, instead of just saying sorry. But we sometimes expect we can only move on if the other person apologizes. So they're just these cultural differences, and they all have their place. They all have their importance. But it's culturally different. It's just sometimes misunderstandings. Is it good, is it bad? It depends. For whom? Right? Do you want to hear a funny story? Yes. Some of you already know this story. Okay, so Tibetans have heard about our way of opening a parcel, right? I mean, opening a gift, not a parcel, but a gift, right? So you should be like in front of the person, you open it. So years ago, when I was in the first or second year of my studies, my teacher, one of my teachers, was so kind. He took care of me really well. And so my parents invited him to Germany. He had some issues with his glasses and some gastric problems, so they wanted to take him to a doctor. Anyway, so he was there for about a month, and people just loved him. We organized a few events. He talked in some schools, and people wanted to meet him. And so it was around, Easter was really early that year, and it just happened to be close to Easter. And people kept asking me, we want to make him a gift. What do you think is a good gift? And I was like, maroon socks? I mean, that was really, I couldn't think of anything, but that seemed a little, maroon socks. How many socks can you wear? And so someone gave him a stuffed rabbit. Because, it was just before Easter. So in the parcel, I mean, it was packed, it was wrapped in wrapping paper. So he very carefully opened it, very slowly, and he went like, whoa, wow, oh, it's a rabbit, it's a stuffed rabbit. Okay, I didn't say anything. He's like, this is amazing. Oh, that's so great. And we were like, why could he like stuffed rabbits that much? Oh, because as a child, maybe he didn't have that many toys, so he likes stuffed animals. Sure enough, next day, stuffed dog. Even a ladybird. I didn't even know you had stuffed ladybirds, and stuffed bears, and stuffed frogs, and dogs. So as, in his room, he had his own room with like a bed and full of stuffed animals. So before we left, he was packing his stuff, and he's like, what am I going to do with all these stuffed animals? And I'm like, what? Don't you like them? Well, how old do you think I am? Why would I like these stuffed animals? This is children's toys. But you said you liked them. No, I never said that. I said, yes, when you open it, you said, whoa. He said, but that's what you do in your culture. And I'm like, not like that. Not like that. Oh, nice, okay. But not like go on for like 10 minutes and look at it from all sides. And he was like, oh, okay, all right. So anyway, he took them with him. He didn't want to be rude. And actually, he gave all of them away. But for years, he still had one bear that you could wear like a puppet, He used to clean his table. So it was kind of cream-colored first and kind of grayish later on. But he always used it to clean his table. So there you go. Well, cultural misunderstandings. So not really knowing, this is considered to be good, but it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, and it can lead to misunderstandings. Anyway, okay. Let's go back to the Heart Sutra. Now we got to the point of the actual sutra, the dialogue, the question of Shariputra, who is called Shariputra because his mother was called Sharika, because she had the eyes of a Sharika bird. It was not the voice, it was the eyes of a Sharika bird. So a particular bird who lives in reed forests. So you can look it up, like a Sharika bird. We've all seen this Indian bird. I forget the Western name for it, but it's kind of got this kind of colored eyes that have a particular shape. So it probably she had these beautiful eyes. That's why she was called Sharika, and her son was called Shariputra. We heard the question. We went through the question. And of course, the question was asked through the blessing of the Buddha, or because of the blessing of the Buddha. And in answer to that, Avalokiteshvara said, so again it says, he said that. He said that means Shariputra asked that particular question. And the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharatvati Putra. Sharatvati, as you know, was the family name of Shariputra. That's why in this case he's addressed as Sharatvati Putra. So the answer is Shariputra. Any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage, sometimes they just say any son or daughter of the lineage, who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent existence. Okay, correctly and repeatedly. Repeatedly is actually, the word I believe is actually subsequently, but anyway, I'll leave it for now. That's not I'll address this later on. So now, first of all, the 5 aggregates. Why are there 5? What are the 5 aggregates anyway? Okay, it's just it's an unusual way to talk about the psychophysical aggregates, right? I mean, the mind and the body. Okay, that we're made of mind and body makes sense, of course. But actually, when we talk about the 5 aggregates, the physical aggregate is just one. Form. It's called form or the body aggregate. Form aggregate. But why are there 4 more? Why are there 4 more aggregates? To put it simply, you have the mental aggregates, of course. And of course, you could divide the mind into sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. That would be one way. You would end up with 7 aggregates, the 6 consciousnesses and the physical, the body conscious, the body aggregate. So the six mental aggregates and the physical aggregate. But here in this case, the division is slightly different because you can divide mind in another way, into what's called mind and mental factors. Mind and mental factors. That's one way of dividing. So take, what is a main mind? Main mind and mental factors makes it sound as if you have like a main mind, that's one entity, and a separate mental factor. But actually that's a misunderstanding. We try to understand the mind. That's our goal as part of Buddhist studies. It's considered to be very important to understand how the mind works. And the mind has many different functions. It does many different things. It engages in a lot of activities, all revolving around its main object. Now let's take a mind thinking about dinner. Okay? Thinking of dinner, thinking about dinner. The most basic function of that mind is to perceive dinner. That's the main function. It just perceives dinner, perceives its object. It is aware of its object, if you want. And that is described as the main mind. So it's really just saying the main function of the mind is to perceive its object, and from that point of view, we talk about a main mind. Okay? From that point of view, we say that's the main mind. It's just another way of saying that's the main function of the mind. But it also has other functions. It discerns its object. It experiences a certain feeling. It experiences pleasure or displeasure or none of the two. Those are other functions. Every time there's a consciousness, you either you have a pleasant experience, an unpleasant experience, or none of the two, which is usually described as a neutral feeling. So it's the mind itself. But from the perspective of perceiving something pleasant, we describe that as the mental factor of feeling. From the perspective of discerning its object, right? Especially when you analyze it, you need discernment, recognizing it and being able to differentiate it from something else. From that perspective, we speak of the mental factor of discernment. But at the same time, the mind also is attentive. It is attentive. which is why you also have the mental factor of attention. So these different functions, at least 5, plus the main function of just perceiving its object. So you always have at least 6 mental functions. And those are, from the point of view of the main function, we speak of the main mind, and all the other functions are described as the mental function, the mental factors. Does that make sense? It sounds like it's a little difficult to grasp this. It's a little bit like that. I sometimes give that example. For instance, Christine, right? So Christine as a person, what is her main function? Being a human being. But she has other functions as well. Her main function being a human being, but she also has the function of being the SBC of a center in Vienna. She has the function of being a mother. She has the function of being a student of the Dharma. She has the function of, I don't know, but let's say you're a good cook, right? Makes great Viennese, oh, is she? Okay, great, Viennese food. And strudel and so forth. So the point being, therefore, there's this main function, that is main Christine. And then there's Christine the cook, and there's Christine the SBC, there's Christine the mother, there's Christine the student. So they're the same person. But I can look at Christine from these different perspectives, right? I can look at it from that. So I call her Christine the cook, Christine the student, Christine the SBC. I make it sound as if those were totally separate entities, but then inseparable. It's the same person I'm actually pointing at, or I'm actually talking about. The main function being of her being a human being. Let's agree on that. And then the other ones are secondary functions. So similarly with main minds and mental factors. So when you look at the aggregates, you have the body aggregate, and then you have the consciousness aggregate, which is another way of saying a main mind, a primary consciousness, a main mind. So it's talking about all the main minds. When I say my 5 aggregates, so the physical aggregate, although there are many parts to it, I speak of the body aggregate, the form aggregate. And then I have many main minds. Eye consciousness, that is a main mind from the point of view of perceiving its main object. Ear consciousness, from the point of view of just perceiving its object, main mind, right? And then all the other 5 consciousnesses, the other sense consciousnesses, the remaining 3. So altogether 5 sense consciousnesses. Each one of them always arises with a main mind, with a main function, and secondary functions. Same is true for the mental consciousness. So all my main minds are part of the consciousness aggregate. Now you've got 2. But we have all these mental functions. We have many different mental functions, usually 51, but more than 51, really. 51 are listed in the texts. However, there are more, actually. And so, now I have to still fill the position of 3 more aggregates. Having heard that there's a main mind, that position has been filled. Now I've got 3 more left. The other 3, actually, as a separate aggregate, is the separately mentioned is the aggregate of feeling and the aggregate of discernment or discrimination. Those are both mental factors. The last category is everything else. It's everything else. So all the other mental factors that are not specifically or separately mentioned, and I don't know, the imprints that are part of the mind, and so forth. That is called compositional factor. So it's almost like this last category that is everything else but the other 4. So the last 3, discernment, feeling, and compositional factor, if they were put just in one category, it would be so much easier. You'd have 3 aggregates. You have body aggregate, you have the main mind aggregate, the consciousness aggregate, and everything else. So much easier. So the question then arises, why are feeling and discernment separated? Why are they, of all the other mental factors that are also very important, why are they explained separately? The answer is in a text called the Abhidharma Kosha by Vasubandhu. Pardon?
They're
They're always?
Present.
Yeah, but for instance, attention is also always present. They're two of the main of the omnipresent mental factors. I mentioned there are 5 functions or 5 mental factors that are always present. So feeling and discernment are always present. But the 3 more, for instance, contact, mental engagement, they're also present. However, they're not mentioned here. Why those 2? So I can get you to guess, but unless you know the answer, I don't think you're going to guess it, and so we're going to go on forever. Might as well just tell you. Okay, so in the Abhidharma Kosha, it says, if you look at philosophers and ordinary people, those 2, philosophers disagree because of discernment. I see it this way, you see it that way. Discernment is just a way of discriminating. This is this is that, to discern between this, that, and the other, to differentiate. So philosophers disagree because how they discern things. This is good, this is bad, this is advisable, this is not, this should be cultivated, this should be avoided. They disagree on that, right? Based on their discernment. Ordinary people disagree based on their feelings, right? I like this, I don't like this. I like you, I don't like you, I don't like that. I like this food, I don't like that food. I like this color. So let's face it, all day long we're basically very much occupied with the sense objects. Beautiful clothes, nice design for our house, so those are shapes and colors. Sounds, this music I like. I need to get a new sound system, right? I go to this concert, I like it, I don't like it. I don't know, fragrant candles and room spray and perfumes. We very much like our smells. Food. Oh, how many cooking shows are on the different channels, right? A lot of cooking shows. A lot of food has become a major part in our life. Food, very important. And tangibility. So many new materials. Stretchy and waterproof. And adjusting to your skin. So we're totally obsessed with all these sense objects. Our whole life revolves around them. We spend a lot of money requiring those that are pleasant and avoiding those that are unpleasant. So as ordinary people, our agreement and disagreement is based on how it feels. How do certain shapes and colors make us feel, how sounds make us feel, and so forth. And of course, in our relationships with one another, just living an ordinary life. So those 2 are therefore separated out. Our disagreement, so philosophers, of which there were many in India at the time of Vasubandhu, when that text was composed, so they disagree based on different discernment, and ordinary people disagree based on feeling.
Why disagreement?
Pardon?
Why is disagreement focused here? Why
Well, because philosophers in India, in ancient India, I mean, disagreement. Oh, why the disagreement?
Because philosophers.
Well, because it may lead to conflicts, right? May lead to conflicts. I don't know why Vasubandhu focused specifically on conflicts, but conflicts very much for ordinary people arise because of feelings. I don't like my neighbor, and I don't like that their tree grows over my side, and that their dog barks, and right? Conflicts. I don't like that this guy looks at me in a weird way, makes me feel uncomfortable, etc., etc. Well, I like, of course, I like this guy, and this other person likes the same guy, so etc. Problems start. And of course, the philosophers, there's debate and so forth, but it can lead to huge disagreements. I mean, between religious systems, you're right, you're wrong, and it's less to do with feeling. But feeling, of course, plays part in it, but also because we are right and you're wrong, and you're wrong and you're and so forth. So that's why they're separated out. I don't know whether there's not another way of course, there could be another way of differentiating, but maybe that was an issue at the time of Vasubandhu in particular. It's more to do, of course, with the time when he lived and the way, conflicts developed and so forth. Okay, so therefore you have those 2, discernment and feeling, separated out. And then you need another category for the rest, or you end up having a lot more. So 5 aggregates. Makes sense, doesn't it? It's a little easier to remember that way. You have the physical aggregate, you have the main function of the mind, from that perspective, the main mind. Then you have discernment and feeling. for the reason I've just given. And then you have this category called compositional factor, which is saying everything else goes in there, right? Everything else goes in there. The other mental factors that were not, they're not part of the other division. And for instance, mental tendencies, imprints, and so forth, whatever is still to do with the mental, but it's none of the other categories. That way it's much easier to remember, isn't it? Okay, so those are the 5 aggregates. What did Shariputra now say? Any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity. So basically, it sounds a little odd. It is a literal translation, but really what it's saying is who wishes to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom. Whoever wants to practice wisdom, who wants to practice emptiness, that is wisdom, should look upon it like this, should understand the following. Correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent of inherent nature. Yeah, I'm used to the translation of inherent existence, but inherent nature. So correctly, should look at it correctly, but repeatedly, yes. So here is the word repeatedly is used, but actually subsequently is a better word, because that's what it says, Jesu in Tibetan, which actually means, it refers to a specific type of initial perception. When you first realize emptiness, you need to infer it, subsequent to certain reasonings. Okay? There's something called an inferential mind, an inferential cognizer, or an inferential mind. We have a lot of inferential minds. We infer based on a certain reason, based on a sign. What is a sign for a fire in my neighbor's house? Smoke. There you go. You'll know. So if we look at a certain building and there's this smoke billowing out of the window, we don't see the fire, but we infer. Subsequent to seeing the smoke, we infer there's fire. So when it says here we should subsequently behold those 5 aggregates, it's saying subsequent to understanding the reason for instance, dependent arising. So subsequent to dependent arising, to understanding that they are dependently arisen as an example for a reason, we should then understand that those 5 aggregates are empty of inherent existence, are also empty of inherent existence. So here the word also, as before, there was the word also was used before as well. In this case, it means specifically as the person lacks inherent existence. In English, it sounds really odd, but in Tibetan, in Tibetan, it's just not a big problem.
Oh, so it's the 5 aggregates
And the person, exactly. So it's saying, just as the person lacks inherent existence, in the same way also, the 5 aggregates are empty of inherent existence. So the word also implies that Avalokiteshvara is here saying, as you know, the Buddha talked about it during the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, that there's no inherently existent person, he's already denied the person. So therefore, during the first turning of the wheel, although he did teach Vaibhashika and Satantrika mainly, but he taught also the path to liberation, and in order to become liberated, you need to realize that phenomena, the self, for instance, doesn't exist inherently. So therefore, the Buddha has already taught, and just as the self doesn't exist inherently, also the 5 aggregates are empty of inherent existence. Jack, it doesn't say that here, right? It doesn't say here, but it's implied here. Correctly and repeating, beholding those 5 aggregates, also just as the self as empty of inherent existence.
You're saying form plus 5 aggregates.
No, I'm saying 5 aggregate in the person. The person. The person. So just as the person, who's the owner of the 5 aggregates, right? Who's the person is labeled on the basis of the 5 aggregates, right? We label the person as the owner and the utilizer. It's not really a utilizer, but that's what we label the person to be, the owner of the aggregates. So here it's saying, therefore, the 5 aggregates and the person, they lack inherent existence. Okay, so Now, it starts to get complicated a little bit. Because what's happening now, from now on, the text is said to not merely, or not just explicitly, not just that it explicitly expresses emptiness, it implicitly now teaches the path to enlightenment. It implicitly teaches the path to enlightenment. So implicitly means in a non-obvious way. The words don't reflect that, but especially when it's explained, but even without explanation, for those who have a certain background, a certain understanding already, to them it is actually implied that it teaches the five path. The five path, which is a very popular way in saying these are the stages to enlightenment. These are the different levels you go through. So the path, the five path, is just a way of saying there are different levels that take you to enlightenment. Who has never heard of the five path? Okay, quite a few of you. Okay, all right. So the five path. Yeah, so the five path are actually explained mainly from the point of view of wisdom. Only from that perspective they're explained. It doesn't mean that you don't need to practice as part of these five levels. You don't need to practice method and so forth. But it doesn't require as much explanation. All right. So therefore, what we need is now to understand what these five paths are. They need to be explained in this context. What is the first path? What is it called? I can't lip read. I still can't lip read. No, I know, you're right. Yes, path of accumulation. Christina said it. Path of accumulation. Right? It's called path of accumulation. Now, it sounds pretty boring, path of accumulation. It doesn't really tell us anything. But the thing is, when I said previously, I talked about the fact when you start off practicing, first it's difficult, it's hard to follow the Mahayana teachings, for instance, but at some point you generate a certain mind, which is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta sometimes seems to be the goal of Mahayana practice, but actually it's just the beginning. Bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment. What is the mind of enlightenment? What is the mind of enlightenment really? How would you explain it? I always make you generate that mind of enlightenment in the morning. I ask you to aspire to something. What do I aspire? What I ask you to aspire to? To benefit other sentient beings, but there's more to it. Yes, benefit sentient beings. I keep saying for the benefit of sentient beings. But what do you aspire to?
To get enlightened so we can release them from the suffering.
Yes, to get enlightened, to attain enlightenment, mainly for the benefit of other sentient beings. Okay, so that is the aspiration. What did I say? Without the wish to do something, we won't set off to do it. We won't start to do it. We won't work towards achieving it. The first step is the wish, which is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is what is called the entryway into the first level, or what's called the Mahayana path, which has actually 4 or 5 levels. If you count the goal as another level, then it has 5. If you don't count the goal as a level, because it's the goal, you've reached the goal, then it's 4. Okay, so you have 4 levels that you have to go through, but to reach the first level, you have to generate bodhicitta, the wish to become enlightened. But for the benefit of others, it should be driven by great love and compassion, right? And it's a mind that arises at some point spontaneous. It's uncontrived, as they call it. Right now, it's contrived. It's artificial. we have to make an effort for it to rise, right? In the morning, I lead you through certain steps, generating love, compassion, so that your mind is already moistened by that kind of these altruistic minds. And then based on that, I ask you to generate bodhicitta. But that requires effort. It's contrived. It's not natural yet because we're not used to it. It doesn't fully make sense why we should become enlightened. But we keep doing it as part of our practice on a daily basis because, well, with habituation, at some point, it'll grow stronger. But the point is that once you have that mind spontaneously, like in any situation, it just arises. You don't need to reflect on these different levels, right? First, affectionate love, then great compassion. They are ever present. They rise spontaneously as well. I mean, they're not ever present at all times, but they do rise spontaneously. You don't need to meditate on them. They just arise, right? You don't need to, well, you still meditate on them to even further deepen them, but you don't need to meditate on them for them to now arise, in a way that requires effort. No, they just pop up. They're there. Once you have that spontaneous, I want to become enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings, and it arises spontaneously at all times, then you have the real mind of enlightenment. Then you're moving towards enlightenment. You've taken the first step. You have the deep, sincere wish to become enlightened. This is your goal now. You can do anything else. You can still drive buses and be a doctor, whatever you want to do. But your main goal, whatever you do, is influenced by that aspiration, by that motivation. And everything you do becomes a cause for enlightenment. Right? It makes it much easier. Is that clarification? Sorry.
There's a term for someone who has the aspiration to become enlightened, but is a solitary realizer.
No.
Is there a similar? Is there like a bodhicitta for them as well in some sort of way?
So the question is like the solitary realizer. We call the solitary realizer Pratyeka Buddha.
Yeah.
And there is this explanation that Pratyeka Buddhas actually want to become enlightened, but for their own benefit. And therefore, as long as it's for your own benefit, the goal cannot be anything more but liberation. So out of renunciation and understanding that samsara has all these limitations and faults, if you then want to reach the goal of enlightenment, but for yourself, you're going to reach liberation for yourself, because it's only for the benefit of others that you can attain enlightenment, right? If your motivation is really dedicated towards all sentient beings, then your goal of enlightenment can be achieved. Because it's like the merit, the positive potential of embracing everyone takes you there. But if it's just for your own person, there's not enough merit. So it's great to do it for your own benefit. It's very meritorious. But the potential is not as great as if your motivation was to take everyone there. Does that make sense? So that's important. That's an important aspect. So once you generate bodhicitta, and of course, when we look at the question, a son or daughter of the lineage. What is a son or daughter of the lineage? It's the Mahayana lineage. It's the Mahayana type. It's someone who has generated bodhicitta. Someone who's generated bodhicitta, how should they now practice? The Mahayana lineage, the Mahayana path, if you like. So there's a way, when we study philosophy, we talk about having the Mahayana lineage and having awakened the Mahayana lineage. There's a difference. Having awakened the Mahayana lineage and having entered the Mahayana path, or having achieved the Mahayana type. There's a difference. To awaken comes fast. It's a weird way of talking. We don't talk like that. I've awakened the Mahayana. Huh? It's a weird way of talking, but that's just the vocabulary, or that's just the terminology they use. So, when do you awaken the Mahayana lineage, the Mahayana, or your Buddha nature, for that matter? Another way of saying is to awaken your Buddha nature. Awaken your Buddha nature. When do you awaken your Buddha nature? Does anyone know? When do you awaken your Buddha nature? When for the first time, your own suffering is not most important. The suffering of others is most important. So when does the suffering of others become most important? Which mind makes you turn, which mind I make you meditate on every morning, that makes you turn towards the suffering of others? Compassion. Great compassion. Great compassion. First I ask you to generate that deep care. That is not yet concerned with the trouble other beings go through. But then I ask you to generate great compassion, where you wish for all sentient beings to be free and you wish to be able to protect them from that suffering. That is said to awaken your Buddha nature, because up to that point, we've mainly thought of our own suffering. Our own suffering is our main concern. To avoid that and instead experience happiness. That's what we do all day long, right? Let's be honest, I mean, that's just what we do. But when based on our understanding of our relationship, interdependence, and so forth, that we're all the same in wanting to be happy and wanting to suffer, in particular in understanding that self-cherishing, and this is important, this is said in many texts, it's stressed very much, especially in Shantideva's Bodhisattva way of life. Self-cherishing is the root of all problems. Cherishing others, based on love and compassion, is the root of all well-being. Self-cherishing is the root of all trouble. Cherishing others is the root of all happiness. If you were able now to sincerely cherish others, trust me, you will no longer experience the problems you experience now. No way. No way. But it's so hard to get there. And there's no pill we could take to have the altruism pill or the cherishing others pill. No, unfortunately there isn't. So, but what I'm trying to say here is, once we have that mind, once our focus is, for the first time, focused on others, we awaken our Buddha nature. That is what's called in Tibetan, I don't know, in Sanskrit as well, but in Tibetan it's like you have just awakened your Buddha nature, your Mahayana lineage as well, Mahayana lineage. And then when you generate bodhicitta based on that great compassion, understanding that only if I become enlightened can I really be fully beneficial in my endeavor to free sentient beings from suffering, well, then once you generate therefore bodhicitta, you enter the Mahayana lineage. You are a son or daughter of the Mahayana lineage. Okay? That's how they talk. We don't talk like that ordinarily. I once taught a class and there was a guy in the class, he was from Texas. I can't do the Texan accent, but he talked like that. We just don't talk like that in Texas. Of course they don't talk like that. We don't talk like that in Germany either. Oh, when did your Mahayana lineage awaken? When did you? Are you a son of the Mahayana lineage? Who talks like that? Right? That's very specific Dharma language. And initially it's like, who can remember all this? But of course you hear it once, you hear it twice, you hear it 3 times, and before long it's become second nature. You're so used to it. Anyway, so here therefore, when you ask about the son or daughter of the lineage, that's in the question. Now the answer is, any son or daughter of the lineage should behold the perfect. So once you've become a son or daughter of the lineage, in other words, once you have generated bodhicitta, you've now entered the Mahayana path. You've generated a Mahayana path consciousness, right? Okay, is that it? Done. Oh, I'm done for now. No more. No, that's only the first step. That's only the first step. Because now we need to remove that which is in the way to becoming enlightened. Remember? I talked about this before. Enlightenment is about removing that which prevents us from becoming enlightened. And although bodhicitta is the first step that moves us in that direction, it's like taking the first step towards enlightenment, but we can now only remove what's in the way by generating the wisdom realizing emptiness. If we haven't already generated that wisdom before generating bodhicitta, which is actually encouraged, to understand emptiness first, because then it makes sense to become a bodhisattva. If nothing exists inherently, it makes sense to take all sentient beings to enlightenment. You understand that enlightenment is possible. Once you realize emptiness, you understand that enlightenment is possible. Because you understand that the root cause of all our sufferings is a wrong mind. Its object doesn't exist because there's no inherent existence. You understand that? And then you understand there's a cause, a root cause. It can be removed by the mind that realizes emptiness, and is worth doing so, and is worth taking everyone else to that same goal. So based on that, you generate bodhicitta. Yes?
When you say get understanding of emptiness, you mean not a direct understanding?
Not a direct, no. It doesn't require a direct experience. A first understanding of emptiness can only be conceptual, right? So in the very beginning, like I said, all our thoughts are conceptual. All our mental consciousnesses are conceptual, unless you've highly evolved, which by implication means when you first think of emptiness, can only be a conceptual mind, right? A conceptual mind, a thought consciousness that gets at emptiness, that takes to mind emptiness. The analogy that's sometimes used is, think of a finger pointing at the moon. Visualize a finger pointing at the moon. The moon represents emptiness. The finger represents the concept of emptiness, the concept, which is that which appears, the generic image. The generic image is just another way of saying the concept of emptiness. Okay, the generic image of emptiness. What emptiness means to you. And of course, in the beginning, we don't get it right. But slowly, as we identify the object of negation correctly in the very beginning, then the generic image, that concept of emptiness, represents the actual idea of emptiness. And through that concept, you can now get at emptiness. But that's initially like someone pointing at the moon. Your thoughts are pointing at the moon, but you're focusing on the finger and the moon. You're still focusing on the finger. Yeah, still focusing on the concept. You don't have a direct experience. You have a direct experience when you no longer need the finger and you just see the moon for what it is, without needing a finger. So in the scriptures, they use this metaphor, this analogy of the finger and the moon. The finger representing, as I just said, the finger representing the concept, and the moon is the actual object. So initially, and this is very, very hard for us to understand, this initial, and actually I meant to talk about this later on, because as part of this process of going through these different stages, it is explained how we go from a conceptual understanding to a direct understanding. So again, you generate bodhicitta. That's the first step. You may have conceptually understood emptiness before you generated bodhicitta, which is encouraged, because then you have a really good understanding of the fact that enlightenment is possible, as an example. But even if you don't, it's okay. First you generate bodhicitta, but then the next step is, now, first of all, you're on the path of accumulation. Path of accumulation. Now, what you want to do is to proceed to the next level, which is called the path of preparation. I'll explain why they're called this, but unless I've explained all the other ones, or at least the third level, it's difficult to explain why it's called the path of accumulation. So just remember, you generated bodhicitta, and you're now on the path of accumulation. And since that is the Mahayana path, the first Mahayana path, you are on the Mahayana path. Okay. So you're on the path of accumulation. What do you need to do now? Well, if you haven't realized emptiness yet, make an effort to realize it. understand it. Realizing versus just being convinced. It's another point that's hard to understand. What's the difference between realizing something and being convinced? It's hard to really define it, but you could say that if you're convinced, you could still be convinced otherwise. Once you realized it, you know. Someone else can tell you everything exists inherently and you won't believe them. You won't be swayed from your understanding, right? If you know, I don't know, that something makes you sick, someone else can tell you, no, 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 you're not going to believe them. If on the other hand you're merely convinced, the other person may be more convincing than your own conviction and may, make you think otherwise. So therefore, first you need to realize that phenomena lack inherent existence. I mean, it may not be all phenomena. We choose something that is easier understood. So the I is encouraged because we're so familiar with I. And because of our self-cherishing, the thing is, it's really funny. Because we have a mind that holds onto the inherent existence of the I, we generate self-centeredness. Or to put it differently, because of our grasping at inherent existence of the self, we generate self-centeredness. But even if we have a mind that holds on to the inherent existence of our neighbor, we don't generate neighbor cherishing or neighbor centeredness. Right? Does that make sense? So, although the mind that holds on to the self as being inherently existent gives immediately rise to the mind that is centered around the self, that cherishes the self more than anything else. Now, we also have the mind that perceives our neighbor to be inherently existent, but that doesn't lead to neighbor cherishing. We have to work hard to overcome self-centeredness to have neighbor cherishing, right? So there's a difference, which also explains why it is important to focus on the self. Because self-centeredness, that which really harms us, is induced by our holding onto an inherently existent self. Whereas the holding onto the inherent existence of the neighbor does not lead to some kind of similar afflictions. All right, that's one reason. We should focus on the self. But we can also focus on things that we know do not exist the way they appear. Right? That we already know. So usually phenomena, another way of just saying that phenomena lack inherent existence is to say that they appear to exist inherently but don't exist in that way. They appear to exist inherently, but they don't exist in that way. That's another way of saying that phenomena lack inherent existence. They appear that way, but they don't exist in that way. For example, a rainbow appears to be solid, but it doesn't exist in that way. The face the reflection of my face appears to be my face, but it's not my face. And I don't know, I remember once my mom came to India and she came with a group and they were staying in this nice hotel in Delhi. And I remember I went to visit her, I went to meet her, and there was this huge mirror that was surrounded by flowers. And I was walking towards it thinking, oh, there's another nun. So I was fooled by the reflection of my own face, of my own body in the mirror. Okay, so that it appeared to be another nun, it appears to be a nun, but it wasn't one. Yeah, so those are examples of phenomena not existing the way they appear. And based on those phenomena, it's easier to understand that not only do they appear as concrete, colorful entities as a rainbow does, but they also appear to exist inherently, which they don't. So it's a little easier on that basis to understand emptiness. But whichever object we choose, we need to focus on that in our meditation. Now, once we've become bodhisattvas, we are now bodhisattvas, by the way. We've just generated the mind of enlightenment, It's spontaneous now, uncontrived, as it's also described. And now things get serious. We have the wish to go somewhere, we need to start walking there, right? So we reflect on emptiness. We reflect on emptiness if we haven't done it yet. So we now, at the very least, or at the latest, start now. Taking the self or whatever. So, by just saying, the self doesn't exist inherently, the self doesn't exist inherently, or reading books that tell me that, I won't get there. The words of the Buddha were not, the words themselves are not a reason that established the lack of inherent existence. In other words, if I say, the self doesn't exist inherently because the Buddha said so, no way, it doesn't take you there. The Buddha said so, it doesn't help. No way. This is why in Buddhism, the scriptures are not enough. The scriptures just point you in the right direction. However, you need to do the work yourself, unfortunately. Just because it says here, there, and however much respect we have, we never understand emptiness. So, what did the Buddha say? Let's look at what the Buddha said. He said phenomena are dependently risen. So, that is a very potent, it's said to be the king of reasoning anyway. The king of reasoning. I don't exist inherently because I'm dependently risen. So, that's one reasoning. But that shouldn't be the only reasoning. Other reasonings, for instance, I don't exist as inherently existent because I'm not one with the aggregates. I'm not separate from the aggregates. And in that way, I come to understand I can't be found. Right? So I can't be found, but I nevertheless exist. I'm dependently arisen. So all these different reasons, you reflect. Subsequent to understanding these reasonings, you then, after a long reflection of understanding the logical connection between dependently arisen and lacking inherently existent, or not being found as one with the aggregates or separate from the aggregates, the relation between that and the lack of inherent existence. Once you understand that, you can infer, right? Just as you can infer from the presence of smoke that there's fire, you can infer from the presence of, or from the fact that the self cannot be found as one and different from the aggregates. The inherently existent I cannot be found in that way. Based on the fact that it exists in dependence and so forth, you can come to understand that it lacks inherent existence. And the first mind that understands that is a conceptual mind, and it's called an inferential cognizer. An inferential cognizer, which works similar to the fire and smoke example. First, you recognize, oh, there's smoke. And you also recognize wherever there's smoke, a certain type of smoke, there must be fire. So you give it some thought. In this case, it's easy. You think about it for a few moments, and then you infer fire in my neighbor's house. Now, that doesn't take long. It takes a few seconds. But emptiness may take a little longer, a lot longer, right? Okay, but never mind. It's the same process, except that in terms of time, it takes a little longer. So you reflect on it again and again and again, and then infer, right? You understand? I mean, just like a whole process you go through, you learn the relationship between that which is the reason and that which is to be established, how they're related, etc., without going into all this detail. Basically, on the basis of these reasonings, at some point you realize, phenomenon, I don't exist inherently. That is the first time you realize emptiness. Now you know. The self lacks inherent existence, okay, with a conceptual mind. And that is that's a huge moment. You should mark in your calendar. Celebrate it every year. No, I'm kidding. But the point is, yes, so you realize emptiness for the first time. But is that already the vacuum cleaner that I've been mentioning? Is that already this mind that can now start removing stuff? No, for two reasons. Two reasons. One reason, it's distracted. It's distracted. It can focus on emptiness for a few moments, but then it gets distracted by something else. So I need to bring the mind back again and again. So for the mind to really effectively make a change in my mind, it needs to be very focused. Right now, it's like a candle in the wind that goes here and there, back and forth. To illuminate a dark room, if you have only one candle, if it just flickers back and forth, you won't have enough light to clearly perceive. So you need concentration. But once you have concentration, again, even if you're fully concentrated while you realize emptiness, you don't directly experience emptiness. You're still looking at the finger and the moon. You're looking at the moon, yes, but it's through your concept of emptiness. Through your concept. It's like when you think of your mom, but this image of your mom is in the way. And the image of your mom is not your mom. The image of your mom is not your mom, but you still need that image to think of your mom. The image of your mom is conjured up by your own mind. It represents your mom. So it's as good as it gets. However, it keeps you from directly experiencing your mom as if she was in front of you. So similarly here with emptiness, you still have that concept of emptiness by way of which you, yes, realize emptiness, but it's in the way to experiencing it directly. So those are the two problems that are still in the way, which is why on the path of accumulation, you're still not on the path of preparation, which is the next path. Yes?
So the inferred experience,
yes.
Is that, just using the analogy of finger and the moon, is it still only finger and not moon? Or is it
it's both finger and moon.
Okay.
Finger and moon both. So it's both finger and moon. In that you still need the concept. You've inferentially understood. So that's great. You've understood. Inferentially just means independence on reasoning. But the mind itself that understands is a conceptual mind. It's a thought that always depends on concepts. Your concept of emptiness. And by way of that, you get at emptiness. Okay.
I've also heard the term a taste experience.
A what?
Taste experience.
A taste experience?
Yeah, just...
You get a taste of emptiness?
Yeah. Would that be a kind of inferred experience?
You kind of get a taste of it. It's not the full experience yet, so you could say that that qualifies as a taste of emptiness, yes. But usually the word taste is used in a slightly different way, that you get a taste for some time through the blessing of a lama, and then it disappears again and you need to do all the work. Oftentimes it's used that way. Okay. Gosh, I realize everything takes much longer to explain than I have kind of planned in my mind. But might as well make sure you understand what a path of accumulation is, what a path of preparation is, to get and all the details you can fill in later. Okay, now we've got time to take a break, 15 minutes. We have time to take a break. My suggestion would be, as an object of meditation, we use the 3 types of dependence. How about it? Right? We want to make it practical in our day-to-day life. And I would suggest using a person we find annoying and so forth, or a perception of a person like in the negative sense, and working with that based on the 3 types of dependent arising. Would that make sense? It's not really emptiness, but I think it's good to also use dependent arising in a meditative way. Okay? Great. So please take a break, 15 minutes, and we meet again for the meditation.